You are not the only human species that ever existed. For most of the time humans have been on this planet, you were never alone. There were others. Other kinds of humans, not apes. Not ancestors in some blurry evolutionary chart. Actual humans, walking upright, making tools, raising children, burying their dead, and almost all of them are gone. Right now, on this entire planet, there is exactly one human species left. You, Homo sapiens. But 300,000 years ago, there were at least 6 different kinds of humans alive at the same time, sometimes in the same valleys, sometimes separated by a single mountain range. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, Homo erectus still surviving on the island of Java, Homo naledi in the caves of South Africa, Homo floresiensis, barely 3 feet tall, hunting pygmy elephants on a small Indonesian island, and you, or rather, the earliest versions of you. And then, one by one, they disappeared. Not all at once, not in some single catastrophe you could point to on a map. They faded out, one species at a time, over tens of thousands of years, until only one was left standing. The question that should keep you up at night is simple. Why them, and not you? Let's start with the one you've probably heard of, the Neanderthals. Picture a Neanderthal hunting party moving through a forest in what is now southern France, about 60,000 years ago. They are not the hunched, dim-witted cavemen from the old textbook drawings. Forget that image completely. A Neanderthal man stood about 5'6", but he was built like a powerlifter. Thick bones, dense muscle, a chest built for hauling. His brain, on average, was slightly larger than yours. Not smaller, larger. He is not swinging a club. He is carrying a wooden spear with a stone point hafted onto the end, using pine resin glue that his group learned to make by heating tree bark in a very specific, controlled way, a process that takes real chemical understanding to get right. He has a fire kit tied to his waist. He knows how to track a red deer for 6 hours without losing the trail, reading broken twigs and bent grass the way you read a phone screen. Neanderthals buried their dead? At a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists found a Neanderthal skeleton surrounded by clusters of pollen, which some researchers believe means flowers were placed in the grave. They cared for their injured. One skeleton found in the same cave belonged to a man who had lost an arm, gone partially blind, and was likely deaf, injuries that would have made him useless as a hunter, and yet he lived for years after those injuries. Someone fed him, someone protected him. That is not survival of the fittest. That is a group of people choosing to keep a broken member of their family alive. For over 300,000 years, Neanderthals dominated Europe and parts of Asia. They survived ice ages that would kill you in a single night if you were dropped into one wearing what you're wearing right now. And then, starting around 40,000 years ago, they vanished. Here's the part that should actually unsettle you. Around that exact same time, your ancestors, Homo sapiens, were pushing north out of Africa and into Neanderthal territory. And within roughly 5,000 years of humans arriving in a region, the Neanderthals there disappear from the fossil record. Every single time. Not once did the two species overlap for long in the same territory. Think about what that actually means for a second. You did not evolve in an empty world. You evolved as one competitor among several, all fighting for the same rivers, the same herds, the same caves. Every choice your ancestors made about where to camp, who to trust, what to hunt, was being made in a world that already had other humans in it, watching, competing, sometimes trading, sometimes avoiding each other entirely. That is not the story most people were taught in school. Most people were taught a straight line, ape, then caveman, then us. The truth is, closer to a crowded family reunion where almost everyone else quietly left the room, one at a time, until you were the only one still sitting at the table. So what actually happened? Did we kill them? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain, and that gap in knowledge is exactly why this question matters. There is no mass grave of slaughtered Neanderthals, no smoking gun. What there is, instead, is a slow accumulation of small disadvantages that added up to extinction. And once you understand what those disadvantages actually were, you start to realize how thin the line was between them surviving and you never existing at all. The first disadvantage was diet. Neanderthals were almost entirely dependent on large game. Mammoth, woolly rhino, giant deer. Hunting these animals meant close-range ambush, which meant a huge number of Neanderthal skeletons show healed fractures identical to the injuries seen in modern rodeo athletes. People who get repeatedly slammed by large animals at close range. Every hunt was a gamble with their own bodies, and a single bad gamble, a tusk to the ribs, a hoof to the skull, could end a hunter's ability to provide for good, which in a group of 20 people is not a personal tragedy, it is a structural crisis. Homo sapiens, meanwhile, were doing something Neanderthals mostly weren't. Fishing, trapping small game, eating shellfish, birds, rabbits, tortoises, whatever was slow enough to catch and small enough to not fight back. Coastal sites in South Africa show Homo sapiens cracking open shellfish on a near-daily basis as far back as 160,000 years ago. A broader diet meant that when the megafauna started disappearing, because the climate was swinging wildly between freezing and warm every few thousand years, sometimes within a single human lifetime, your ancestors had backup food sources sitting quietly in tide pools and rabbit burrows. Neanderthals, tied to the herds, did not. The second disadvantage was social scale. This is the one that should really make you pause. Genetic evidence suggests Neanderthal groups were small, maybe 15 to 30 individuals, and largely isolated from one another. Homo sapiens groups appear to have maintained wider social networks, trading, meeting, exchanging partners with groups hundreds of miles away. Archaeologists have found seashells and colored pigments at Homo sapiens sites hundreds of miles from any ocean or mineral source. That means these objects were passed hand to hand across huge distances, which means there were social ties, alliances, trade routes stretching across the continent. Why does that matter for survival? Because a small, isolated group that loses 10 members to a bad winter has no one to rebuild from. Their gene pool shrinks, their knowledge dies with the people who held it, and the next generation starts from a weaker position than the last. A connected network of groups can absorb a local disaster. One valley freezes over, but the humans in it were connected to 5 other valleys. Someone remembers a route to better hunting ground, someone takes in survivors, and the population survives. Neanderthals were living in a world of small islands, each one eventually sinking on its own. Your ancestors were living in a world of bridges, and when one bridge burned, there were 3 others still standing. Picture it from the inside for a moment. You are a Neanderthal mother watching your group's numbers drop below what feels survivable. There is no other camp 2 valleys over that your children can marry into because, as far as you know, there is no other camp. Your entire genetic future rests on the handful of people standing around this one fire. Now picture the same scene from a Homo sapiens camp 100 miles away. A stranger arrives carrying a shell necklace from a coastline nobody in your group has ever seen, offering it as a gift, speaking a dialect close enough to yours to understand. That stranger represents an entirely different chance at survival, a new bloodline, new knowledge, a new place to run to if the winter turns bad enough. One species was playing a game with a handful of pieces. The other was playing with an entire board. Then there is the part that is almost impossible to fully process. Interbreeding. This did not end in total separation. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had children together. If you are of non-African descent, somewhere between 1% and 2% of your own DNA, right now, in every cell in your body, is Neanderthal. You are, quite literally, walking around with a piece of an extinct species inside you. They did not vanish completely. They were absorbed, diluted into a much larger, much more connected population until there weren't enough of them left, genetically distinct, to count as their own species anymore. There is a 4th species tangled up in this same story that most people have never even heard of, and we mostly know it exists because of a single finger bone. In 2008, in a cave in Siberia called Denisova, researchers found a tiny fragment of a pinky finger belonging to a young girl. The bone alone told them almost nothing. But the DNA extracted from inside it told them everything. It did not match Homo sapiens. It did not match Neanderthals either. It belonged to an entirely separate branch of humanity, now called the Denisovans, a species so poorly represented in the fossil record that scientists have reconstructed most of what they know about it purely from genetics rather than skeletons. And yet, Denisovan DNA shows up today in modern populations across Asia and the Pacific, most heavily in Tibetans, who carry a Denisovan gene variant that helps their blood function efficiently at extreme high altitude, a survival advantage handed down from a species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. An entire extinct species known almost entirely from one finger bone is quietly helping people breathe on mountains today. Now go to the other side of the world, to a small volcanic island in Indonesia called Flores. In a limestone cave there, in 2003, archaeologists found a skeleton of an adult woman who stood barely 3 feet 6 inches tall. At first, some scientists assumed she must be a modern human with a growth disorder, but the skull told a different story. Her brain was about the size of a chimpanzee's, roughly 1/3 the volume of yours. And yet stone tools were found around her. tools sophisticated enough to butcher the pygmy elephants that also lived on the island. This species, now called Homo floresiensis, but nicknamed by the press as the Hobbit, lived on Flores for possibly over 700,000 years. Isolated on an island, cut off from mainland populations, their bodies shrank over generations. A well-documented biological pattern called island dwarfism, the same process that shrunk elephants on the island down to the size of a large cow. Small bodies need less food, and on a small island with limited resources, less food means survival. The hobbits survived enormous odds for hundreds of thousands of years on a speck of land in the middle of the ocean, hunting animals many times their size, using fire, making tools, and then, somewhere around 50,000 years ago, right around the time Homo sapiens is believed to have reached that part of Indonesia, they disappear from the record too. There's a detail from Flores that local legend never fully let go of. The indigenous people of the island have oral traditions describing small, hairy forest people called the Abu Gogo, who reportedly lived in caves and were eventually driven off or killed by the ancestors of the current population. Nobody can prove the story is a folk memory of the actual hobbits, but the timing and the description lines up in a way that is very hard to ignore. Then there's Homo naledi, discovered in 2013 in a cave system in South Africa called Rising Star, a system so narrow in places that the researchers who recovered the bones had to be small enough to fit through a gap barely 7 inches wide. Homo naledi had a brain about a third the size of yours, but a body built for both climbing and walking. And the placement of the bones deep in a chamber that would have required deliberate, difficult, dangerous descent in total darkness has led some researchers to argue this was intentional, that naledi may have been carrying their dead into that chamber on purpose. If true, and this is still fiercely debated, it would mean a species with a brain a third the size of yours was engaging in something that looks like ritual tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone expected a non-sapient species to be capable of it. So if these other species had big brains or tight family bonds or ritual behavior, or survived hundreds of thousands of years against terrifying odds, what did your ancestors actually have that all of them eventually did not? It probably was not raw intelligence. Neanderthal brains, again, were not smaller than yours. It probably was not toughness. Neanderthals were physically stronger than any human alive today. It was not even necessarily aggression, since there's shockingly little direct evidence of large-scale violence between the species. What your ancestors seem to have had, more than any of the others, was flexibility at scale, the ability to form connections between groups that had never met, the ability to shift diet, shift tools, shift shelter type, shift social structure, depending on whatever the environment demanded that decade. Every other human species that has been found so far seems to have specialized. Neanderthals specialized in cold climate, big game hunting. Floresiensis specialized in small island survival. Naledi specialized in a very specific cave environment. When the world shifted under their feet, and it did shift again and again through ice ages and warm periods and volcanic winters, specialists ran out of room to adapt. Homo sapiens never really specialized in one environment. Within a span of maybe 60,000 years, your ancestors were living in Arctic tundra, tropical rainforest, high-altitude mountains, and open desert, using completely different tools, different clothing, different food strategies in each place. A group in Siberia was sewing tailored, fitted